Starwalker Studios presents Game Master's Journey, your multidimensional RPG podcast. Hello, fellow gamer. Welcome to episode 192 of Game Master's Journey. I'm your host, Lex Starwalker. On this show, we discuss the craft and the art of game mastering. I've been running RPGs for over 26 years now, and I produce this show in the hopes that you can benefit from my experience, my triumphs, and my mistakes. Today, I return to Xanathar's Guide to Everything. We're going to talk more about the second half of the book, the material for game masters, and tease out some of the new and wonderful things you can expect to find in Xanathar's Guide to Everything. I don't know for sure how much of this we'll get through today, but we'll get through as much as we can. This is actually the third episode I've done on Xanathar's Guide. So if you would like to check out the previous two episodes, I started with episode 188, Tour of Xanathar's Guide to Everything, in which I kind of just went through the book really quickly to let you know what's all in there. And then in episode 189, I dug into the tool proficiencies and what was done with tool proficiencies in Xanathar's Guide, which is in the second half of the book, the chapter 2, I believe it is, which is the GM material. So today, for part 3 of our exploration of Xanathar's Guide, we will be talking about additional things in part 2, or chapter 2, I guess I should say, which is lots of tools for GMs to use at your table. Now, other than in the overview, I haven't talked a lot about the player options in Xanathar's Guide, partly because we tend to focus on the GMing side of the screen here on Game Master's Journey, partly because those options were given to us in Unearthed Arcana, and although there's been some minor changes to them, for the most part, they're as they appeared in Unearthed Arcana. But that said, if you would like to hear about the player options, let me know, and let me know specifically what you'd like to hear about. There are so many in there that unless there's really a desire for it, I'm not going to go through every player option. But if there's a particular thing you'd like to hear me talk about, or you want to hear my opinion on, let me know, and I'll be happy to talk about it. Now, real quickly, while we're talking about the player side of Xanathar's Guide to Everything, I do have some players in my D&D group that are using some of the options, specifically some of the subclasses from Xanathar's Guide. And we started our campaign before Xanathar's Guide came out. So they started out using the Unearthed Arcana version. And now that Xanathar's is out, we're working on switching over to the Xanathar's version. So the subclasses that we're specifically using from Xanathar is the School of Glamour Bard and the College of Schools, the College of Swords Bard. So they're actually both Bard subclasses. Now, I haven't gone through all of the new subclasses in Xanathar's Guide and compared them to the versions we got in Unearthed Arcana. But when it comes to the Swords Bard and the Glamour Bard, I can tell you that the version in Xanathar's Guide works almost exactly like the version in Unearthed Arcana. There are a few very minor changes, and all of those changes improve the ability in a small way. So for instance, with the Glamour Bard, they have a mantle, I think it's called Mantle of Inspiration, that in the Unearthed Arcana version, I think it had them rolling 2d6 or something like that to see how many temporary hit points they give to people. And in the Xanathar's, in the updated version, it's just a straight number. I think it's 5. So those numbers might be wrong, but I did compare the flat number that they gave you in Xanathar's Guide versus the die roll that they gave you in the Unearthed Arcana. And not only does the Xanathar's version get rid of the need for a die roll, which is going to speed up play a little bit, but they also were consistently slightly better than the average result of that roll. So the end result is actually a slight increase in the effectiveness of that ability, and it's just a lot easier to use and play because it doesn't add another die roll to the game. Another example is, I can't remember now I think it's from the College of Glamour. There's another ability that used to take 10 minutes to use, and now it only takes a minute. In the Swords College, they have different flourishes they can do. And in the Unearthed Arcana version, for instance, the defensive flourish, the bard could roll her bardic inspiration die and add the result of that to her armor class. And that has been improved in Xanathar's Guide in that you still roll the bardic inspiration, you still add it to your armor class, but you also add it to the damage of the attack that you're doing. So again, that's only 2 subclasses out of the however many there are in there. So it's a pretty small sample size. So I'd be cautious to assume based on that these kinds of changes are the same in all the subclasses across the board. But at least in these 2 specific ones, the changes were extremely minor, to the fact that if this were all you were getting out of Xanathar's Guide were these subclasses, I don't know that it'd be worth getting it just for that, because the changes are so minor. They're not really going to make a big difference in your gameplay. But the changes are minor, and they are all for the better. A slight buff in what things do, which is kind of interesting, because I'm pretty sure I've heard folks from Wizards say that when they release things for Unearthed Arcana, they intentionally make it a little overpowered. If they're going to err, they err on the side of it being overpowered as opposed to underpowered. And then through playtesting, if they need to, they dial it down. So it's kind of interesting that, at least with these 2 examples, the changes were dialing it up a little bit and not dialing it down. So I just find that interesting. So I'm curious if you have examined the other subclasses in Xanathar's Guide and compared them to the Unearthed Arcana versions. Did your observations, are they agreeing with the observations I have about these subclasses? Are they fairly minor as far as the changes that are made? Have you found any subclasses that are very different from the Unearthed Arcana version? And do those changes tend to make the subclass actually a little better than it was in Unearthed Arcana? I'd be really interested to hear your experiences with that. You can email me at gamemastersjourney@gmail.com. Love to hear from you. But like I said, I'm not planning to go super deep into the player options in Xanathar's Guide, which, just to remind you, in addition to all the new subclasses, we have new feats, and we have new spells, and we have new magic items in the form of common magic items. So right now I'm planning to focus more on the GM side of things, but if there's any of that player focused stuff that you would like to hear about on the show, please let me know. I'll happily talk about it if people want me to. All right, so really quickly, we are going to move into our main segment, and I'm going to crack open Xanathar's Guide. But before we do that, I just want to remind you that you can get Game Master's Journey t-shirts from Spreadshirt. You can find a link to our Spreadshirt store in the show notes at starwalkerstudios.com. You can also check out my module that I've published for D&D called The Trickster's Labyrinth, also found at starwalkerstudios.com. And those are just 2 ways that you can help support the podcast and what I'm doing over here. And I greatly appreciate everyone who does so. Also want to remind you that if you would like to become further a part of our community and network with other listener GMs, there are 2 great ways to do so. One is to join our community on Google+. You can find a link to that in the show notes. And the other is to join our Discord server, and you can find a link to that in the show notes as well. Want to thank everybody who's joined both communities and is participating. Really, really enjoy learning from all you listener GMs out there. And finally, I want to send a huge shout out and thank you to Joseph for your very generous donation to Star Walker Studios. I really, really appreciate it, sir. And it's another great way you can support the show is by making a one-time donation. It's not even a word. So thank you so much, Joseph. I really appreciate that. Could not do this without your support. So thank you very much. So without further ado, let's move on to our main segment and crack open that Xanathar's Guide. All right. Coming back at you with some more goodness from Xanathar's Guide to Everything. And I just got to say, just a general statement to get us started here today. I just got to say that I am really, really impressed with two of the books we've gotten for 5th edition since the Core 3. Those two books being Volo's Guide to Monsters and Xanathar's Guide to Everything. You know, sometimes you see people ask questions like, you know, hey, I've got the DMG and the Player's Handbook and the Monster Manual. What should I get next? You know, what would you recommend? And in a lot of games, once someone has a core book or books, you know, there can be a lot of discussion and debate about, whoa, what's the next thing you should get? In 5th edition, I don't think there's really any need for a discussion or a debate. It's pretty cut and dry. You want to get Volo's Guide to Everything, and you want to get Volo's Guide to Monsters, and you want to get Xanathar's Guide to Everything. Now, if you are primarily a GM, I think you're going to get the most bang for your buck from Volo's Guide because it's got a lot of new monsters for you to use and goes into really great detail about some different types of monsters like goblins and orcs and things like that. Really useful stuff for GMs. If you're a player primarily, then you're going to get more bang for your buck from Xanathar's Guides. But both books have things for all players, whether you primarily GM or play. And I think especially if you do GM, you're ultimately going to want both of them. So, you know, there's lots of adventures that have been put out for the game as well. So if you're wanting to run a canned adventure, then choosing your favorite among those would be another obvious choice. But I just say as a general statement for people looking to expand their D&D collection, I would definitely start with Volo's Guide and Xanathar's Guide because they're fantastic. But we're not here to talk about Volo's Guide today. I just have it on my mind because I was working on my own campaign today and using Volo's Guide and just once again marveling at what a great resource it is. And I would say, if you're a DM and you're running your own stuff, or you're even if you're running a canned adventure, but you're customizing it with your own stuff, I would highly recommend using Volo's Guide, especially if you have it, obviously, even so far as to making it a point to use at least one of the monsters that's really detailed in Volo's Guide, because you're given so much information there. If you want to use gnolls, or you want to use kobolds or whatever, you're given so much to work with that I really highly recommend if you're coming up with ideas for an adventure or a campaign that you start with Volo's Guide. Look at those monsters that they really detail in the beginning of Volo's Guide and use one of those for your inspiration and run with it. So can't recommend Volo's Guide enough. But like I said, we're here to talk about Xanathar's Guide today. So, you know, this book is interesting because it has huge chapters. So chapter 1, which is all the player option stuff, goes all the way until, let's see here, trying to find the beginning of chapter 2. Chapter 1 goes all the way to page 75. There's a few pages of introduction there at the beginning. But yeah, all the way to 75. So yeah, it's kind of crazy. But before we start with chapter 2, there is a little bit that I skipped in our previous episode from the introduction, specifically on page 5, that I want to go over really quickly before we get into chapter 2, because again, this is information for game masters specifically. And this is the section called the core rules. Now, this is for the most part information that's either in the player's handbook or the Dungeon Master's Guide already. I've heard some people saying like this is new information. It's not. For most of this is actually in the player's handbook or the Dungeon Master's Guide already. It's just people tend to overlook it or forget it. So for a great review of those two books, look to my series of episodes on the Player's Handbook and the Dungeon Master's Guide. That series is ongoing. We're still working on that. But check those out to get a refresher on what's actually in those books, because there's a lot in there that people overlook or forget about. So this isn't really new information. It's more shining a light on some of these really important fundamental concepts and rules behind the game of D&D that people tend to forget or overlook or misunderstand. These also are things that have been further explained in Sage Advice. So basically what this is some of the most common questions that have come up in Sage Advice that Jeremy Crawford gets kind of spelled out for you. So I thought it would be helpful, since we're talking about the rules of the game, to go over some of this stuff. So first here it says that the DM adjudicates the rules. One rule overrides all others. The Dungeon Master is the final authority on how the rules work and play. The DM's the final authority, not the Player's Handbook, not the DMG, not the Monster Manual, not some post on Reddit or a forum, the DM. Rules are part of what makes D&D a game. I mean, other than just improvised storytelling. And I sometimes feel like we need to be reminded of this. Without rules, it's not a game. And D&D is a game. Most, if not all of your players, when they sit down, have signed up to play a game. The game's rules are meant to help organize and even inspire the action of a D&D campaign. The rules are a tool, and we want our tools to be as effective as possible. No matter how good those tools might be, they need a group of players to bring them to life and a DM to guide their use. The DM is key. Many unexpected events can occur in a D&D campaign, and no set of rules should reasonably account for every contingency. If the rules tried to do so, the game would be a slog. An alternative would be for the rules to severely limit what characters can do, which would be contrary to the open-endedness of D&D. Here's the path the game takes. It lays a foundation of rules that a DM can build on, and it embraces the DM's role as the bridge between the things the rules address and the things they don't. So really quickly, just want to point out here, this whole section here, the DM adjudicates the rules. Might sound like introductory stuff, and in a way it is, but it's also making a really important point. That's a point I don't think can be made too often, which is the DM adjudicates the rules, not the books. And as someone who streams games on YouTube, I can tell you there are a lot of people out there that don't understand that. I get so many comments on YouTube videos where people are arguing the way I ruled something, or they're arguing the way I ran an encounter from a published adventure. And these people seem to think that the DM is no more than an AI running programs, running code, and the DM should not deviate from that programming. The DM should never run an encounter other than how it's explicitly stated in the published adventure. The DM should never make a ruling other than what's explicitly stated in the core books. And that's simply just not the way this game is played. And to all those people on YouTube, I just got to say, read this, take it to heart. Rule 0, it exists there for a reason. And that reason is to facilitate fun. It may be that the given ruling that's agreed upon in the Player's Handbook and the DMG and Sage Advice just doesn't work for a certain situation in your game. Maybe it doesn't work because it's not what's dramatically appropriate. Maybe it doesn't work because it just is silly or even stupid in that particular situation, or for 100 other reasons. But the point is, that the GM is there. We have a living, breathing, creative human being there to deal with those things and to make executive decisions when those things happen. Or just when their muse or their artistic vision directs them to do so to make the game better for everybody. Now, there is one case, I think, where a player being a quote rules lawyer can be in the right. And that is when the player is relying on an ability, whether that's a class ability or a spell or a magic item, that they think they understand based on the rules that they have. And that thing doesn't work the way that they think it does because the DM is doing it differently. That can be a case where, we need to have a discussion, right? Because I've been on both sides of that, and it can be very frustrating as a player when you think, oh, okay, so my spell works a certain way, given the rules, like say counter spell. If the spell I'm trying to counter is, third level or lower, it's automatic. Otherwise, I get a chance to counter it with a roll, right? So that's the way counterspell works in the rules. So I, as a player, maybe I'm playing a wizard and I choose counterspell as one of my spells and I plan to use it. I'm banking on the fact that it actually works that way. Now, if I'm in the middle of an encounter and I find out, the way this DM runs counterspell, it just flat out can't counter a spell higher than third level. Or you have to make a roll no matter what level the spell is that you're trying to counter. Even if it is third level or lower, you still have to roll something like that. Then that's going to affect my tactics and my strategies. Might even change things so much that I would have not have taken counterspell if I'd known that's the way it works. So, if you're a player in that situation, I would just, wait till between sessions when you have plenty of time to talk with your GM about it and just make your GM aware of how the spell works in the rules or the ability or whatever. And just say, hey, I took this or I want to use this because this is my understanding of how it works in the rules. And you're doing it this different way. And it's making this spell a lot less good and effective, even to the point where I kind of wish I hadn't chosen this spell now. And then, give your DM a chance to change your mind or figure out some solution, because there's a lot of reasons why a DM might run something like counterspell differently. And one of those reasons is the DM just didn't remember how counterspell worked and didn't want to take time in the game to look it up. Another reason might be that your DM's afraid of counterspell. I think a lot of DMs are afraid of counterspell. Or who knows? I mean, there's a million reasons why a DM might change the way the spell works. The DM may not have even intended to change the way the spell works. The DM may be confused about the way the spell works or has an understanding of how the spell works from a previous edition of the game and doesn't realize that it works differently in 5th edition. So I would just, if you're the player in that situation, I'd really recommend just talking with your DM about it and figuring out what's going on and see if you can work something out. And if you're the DM, I always recommend understand the rules first before you change them, right? So if you're changing the way a spell works just because you don't understand the way the spell works and you don't want to learn how the spell works, shame on you. I mean, kind of, learn the rules. Now, I'm not saying do it during play, but in between sessions, you could look up counterspell and figure out how it really works. And if you realize that your house rule is gypping a player, maybe say, hey, now that I know how the spell works, we're going to do it right. But at the very least, think about what you're doing. And anytime you make a house rule or you change a rule, how does it affect the players? How does it affect the game overall? If I nerf counterspell, that affects every player who's chosen counterspell as an ability or a spell or is planning to. So that's something I should think about. All right. So returning to Xanathar's guide, our next section is 10 rules to remember. So here we're going to go over 10 rules to keep in mind and help you better understand the game. And again, these aren't new rules. This is all in the core books. Exceptions supersede general rules. And I'm not going to read this word for word. It's a very simple concept. basically means that this rule is set up, or this game is set up with general rules that apply generally, which is to say they apply at all times unless a more specific rule instead applies. And then we have more specific rules. So anytime there is a general rule and a more specific rule, and the two rules contradict one another, the more specific rule wins. It's really that simple. If you play Magic the Gathering or any game similar to it, you're very familiar with that Magic works under the same principle. We have very, for the most part, simple rules that govern the game. And then every card we play is some exception to those rules, lets you do something that you normally couldn't do. Same thing in D&D. We have our general rules, and then we have all kinds of exceptions to those rules. And those exceptions can be class abilities, they can be feats, they can be spells, they can be magic items. So, this is a really important concept. Really important. So another thing that isn't spelled out explicitly in these pages, but that Jeremy Crawford has talked about on Sage Advice and in Sage Advice, is that another meaning of this is that a specific rule doesn't change the general rule. So, just because, for instance, let's say you have a fire spell, and I'm sure there's a specific example of this. I just can't think of one off the top of my head. I don't want to take the time to look it up because it doesn't matter. But let's say you have a fire spell that says that, the fire, you rolled a hit or whatever, it does its damage, and it says something to the effect of any unattended objects in the area of effect catch fire. Right? So let's say you have a spell that says that. That is a specific rule, okay? But that does not create a new general rule. You don't take that and say, oh, well, then that must mean that any fire spell will set fire to unattended objects. No, just that very specific spell that says it does that. If another fire spell does that, it will say that it does that. And the reason that they designed it this way, and Jeremy discusses this and explains it really well in the Sage Advice segment on the podcast, is that, they didn't want you to have to know and understand every spell in the game to make sense of a given spell, which is what would happen if you had a situation like that, where if one fire spell says it sets unattended objects on fire, then that means all fire spells do. Right? So if you haven't read that one fire spell that says that, then you don't know that all the other fire spells do that, right? It's not very good design. And that is how the game worked in some previous editions, I think. But in 5th edition, if there is a specific rule that trumps a general rule, it will tell you explicitly. You don't have to make these deductions and say, oh, well, since this spell does this thing, then every other spell like it also does that thing. It's not the way it works. So it's really pretty easy. You learn the general rules of the game, and then you just live by those rules unless you have a specific rule staring you in the face that tells you to do something different. All right, next we have round down. Whenever you divide or multiply a number in the game, you round down if you end up with a fraction or a decimal, even if it's greater than 1/2. So you always round down. The only exception, that's a general rule, right? Always round down is a general rule. So the only time you don't round down is if you have a specific rule that supersedes that. So there are certain abilities or spells that will tell you to round up, for instance, or will tell you, for instance, your hit dice. Okay. So when you recover hit dice, you recover half your level in hit dice with a long rest. So if you're second level, with a long rest, you recover 1 hit die. But the rule specifically says with a minimum of 1 hit die. So, going by the general rule, if I was level 1, on a long rest, I recover half my hit dice, which would be half a hit die, and I would round down to 0, right? But we have a specific rule for hit dice recovery that says, no, you have a minimum of 1. So that's a perfect example of specific beating general, and it's a perfect example of an exception to the always round down rule. But again, if you don't have a specific spelled out exception, you always round down. Advantage and disadvantage. Even if more than one factor gives you advantage or disadvantage on a roll, you have it only once. And if you have advantage and disadvantage on the same roll, they cancel each other out. And it doesn't matter how much advantage or disadvantage you have. As soon as you have one advantage, you can stop counting because there's just advantage. You can't have one advantage, two advantage, three advantage. As soon as you have one disadvantage, you can stop counting. And as soon as you have at least one of each, you can stop counting and it becomes a normal roll. So even if I have one thing giving me advantage and I have 5 things giving me disadvantage, it doesn't matter. They just cancel each other out and it's a normal roll without advantage or disadvantage. Combining different effects. This is really simple. I really love how simple this is compared to, say, 3rd edition. Different game effects can affect a target at the same time. For example, 2 different benefits can give you a bonus to your armor class. But when 2 or more effects have the same proper name, only one of them, the most powerful one if their benefits aren't identical, applies while the duration of the effects overlap. For example, if Bless is cast on you, when you're still under the effect of an earlier Bless, you gain the benefit of only one casting. Similarly, if you're in the radius of more than one aura of protection, you benefit only from the one that grants the highest bonus. Easy peasy, couldn't be simpler. Reaction timing. Certain game features let you take a special action called a reaction in response to some event. Making opportunity attacks and casting the shield spell are 2 typical uses of reactions. If you're unsure when a reaction occurs in relation to its trigger, here's the rule. The reaction happens after its trigger completes, unless the description of the reaction explicitly says otherwise. Once you take a reaction, you can't take another one until the start of your next turn. So, for example, a common reaction is the ready action, which is where you state a trigger and then what your readied action will be, and you use your reaction to take that readied action. So let's say you say, I'm going to ready an action, and the trigger is when someone enters the room, when an enemy, let's say, enters the room, my reaction will be, I will fire an arrow at it. Okay. So if you're wondering, well, when does that reaction occur? When do I fire the arrow? Well, it's after the trigger completes. So the trigger was an enemy enters the room. So as soon as the enemy enters the room, you fire the arrow, not before. An even more specific example is, let's say you say the trigger is when an enemy attacks one of my allies, I will shoot it with an arrow. Okay, so the trigger is when an enemy attacks one of my allies. So to answer to the question of when do I get to shoot my arrow, you shoot your arrow after the trigger action is completed and the trigger was attacks my allies. So let's say a goblin comes in and attacks your ally. You roll your attack for your arrow after the goblin attacks the ally, and that attack is resolved, whether they hit or miss and do damage. And then after that, then you do your triggered reaction, which just makes sense, right? How can you, if your reaction is an if-then statement, if trigger happens, then reaction happens, then, by definition, the reaction can't happen until the trigger has happened. You can't react to a trigger before the trigger happens, right? So I guess maybe the confusion is people thought they happened simultaneously, but that would get a little confusing. So that doesn't happen. And I've noticed that the D&D tries to avoid things happening simultaneously because that can be confusing. So for instance, if 2 people roll the same initiative, the suggested solution to that is whoever has the highest dexterity goes first. They don't go at the same time because that's confusing. Or alternatively, you could have the players decide who goes first, but having everybody do their thing at the same time is just needlessly confusing. So we don't do it that way. And that's why. Resistance and vulnerability. Here's the order that you apply modifiers to damage. First, any relevant damage immunity. Second, any addition or subtraction to the damage. Third, 1 relevant damage resistance. And fourth, 1 relevant damage vulnerability. Even if multiple sources give you resistance to a type of damage you're taking, you can apply resistance to it only once. The same is true of vulnerability. And this is a thing I just put a little post-it note on my GM screen with this information because you're going to have to use it quite a bit before you memorize it. And it is a little noodly. So it's a nice thing to have on reference of, how you apply damage and resistance and vulnerability in what order. Because it does matter. It does change the math, what order you do those things. So it's nice to have it spelled out. So I just, scan that and print it out and put it on my GM screen or write it on a little post-it note and put it on my GM screen. And yeah, it's a good little thing to have. Proficiency bonus. If your proficiency bonus applies to a roll, you can add the bonus only once to the roll, even if multiple things in the game say your bonus applies. Moreover, if more than one thing tells you to double or have your bonus, you double it only once or have it only once before applying it. Whether multiplied, divided, or left at its normal value, the bonus can only be used once per roll. Again, pretty cut and dry. I think the only time this really gets confusing is when you have a player trying to find loopholes. But if you just use common sense, most of this should really be pointing out the obvious to you, I think. Bonus action spells. If you want to cast a spell that has a casting time of 1 bonus action, remember that you cannot cast any other spells before or after it on the same turn, except for cantrips with a casting time of 1 action. Concentration. As soon as you start casting a spell or using a special ability that requires concentration, your concentration on another effect ends instantly. And I will remind you, since we were just talking about readying an action, that when you ready an action to cast a spell, 2 things happen. First of all, you're considered to be concentrating on that spell from the moment you ready the action to cast it to the moment when you actually cast it, which means that concentration can be interrupted. And second, you lose the spell slot whether or not you cast a spell. So if I set a trigger of when a goblin enters the room, I'm going to cast magic missile at it, and my turn goes by and a goblin never enters the room and it's my next turn now, then I lose that first level spell slot I was going to use to cast magic missile. So you'll notice that this implies, and this might actually be stated in the rules, but it definitely implies that as a GM, if you have a player saying, I'm going to ready an action to cast this spell, and it's a spell like Magic Missile that they can cast at different levels, I would ask them what level they're planning to cast at, because it's going to matter. Because as part of readying the action, they have to declare what level they're casting at. So if the character says, or the player says, I'm going to ready an action to cast Magic Missile at 3rd level, then they lose a 3rd level spell slot, whether or not they actually end up casting that spell. So that's the way that works. Temporary hit points. Temporary hit points aren't cumulative, which means you don't add them together if you get temp hit points from multiple sources. If you have temporary hit points and receive more of them, you don't add them together unless a game feature tells you you can. Again, unless there's a specific rule that supersedes this general rule. Instead, you decide which temporary hit points to keep. So you do get to decide. So if they're the same, I take the more recent ones, assuming they have some kind of duration. Oh, and speaking of temporary hit points, another question that comes up quite a bit in my group that I finally looked up and found the answer to is, when do temporary hit points go away? And the answer is, again, unless there's a specific rule that says otherwise, temporary hit points go away with a long rest. So if you have an effect giving someone a temporary hit points, if that effect tells you how long they last, then they last that long. If it doesn't say anything, then they last until the person takes a long rest. And that, my friends, is the end of that section. So we can now move on to chapter 2.
This is Matthew Colville, and you're listening to Game Master's Journey.
I want to take a minute to give a quick shout out to the patrons of Starwalker Studios. The support of the patrons makes this show possible. If you enjoy Game Master's Journey and you'd like to give a little back, becoming a patron is a great way to do so. It's because of the patrons that all the listeners of Game Master's Journey enjoy 2 bonus episodes every month. I'd also like to give a huge shout out and thank you to my tier 5 patron, Steve. Let's hear it for Steve.
Yeah.
Yes.
You the man.
Thank you so much, Steve, and thank you to all the patrons. You can find out more about becoming a patron by clicking on the Patreon button at the top of the show notes at starwalkerstudios.com. All right, we are returning to Xanathar's Guide, and we're now ready for Chapter 2, Dungeon Master's Tools. So we start out with a few kind of general basic things, some expansions on the system and some clarifications and just corner cases for us, I guess. So we start out with simultaneous effects. Most effects in the game happen in succession, following an order set by the rules or the DM. In rare cases, effects can happen at the same time, especially at the start or end of a creature's turn. If two or more things happen at the same time on a character or monster's turn, the person at the game table, whether player or DM, who controls that creature, decides the order in which those things happen. For example, if two effects occur at the end of a player character's turn, the player decides which of the two effects happens first. So again, like I was saying in the previous segment, the game really avoids things happening simultaneously. So even when things happen simultaneously, the person, the flesh and blood person at the table in control of that creature or character, decides in what order they happen. Next, we're going to have some expansions on falling and taking damage while you fall. So the basic rule from the player's handbook for falling is at the end of the fall, you take 1d6 bludgeoning damage for every 10 feet you fell to a maximum of 20d6. You also land prone unless you somehow avoid taking damage from the fall. I will also add that the whole idea of making an acrobatics check to take less damage, that's a house rule. That's not in the rules. And I recommend against doing it that way for two reasons. First of all, you're ripping off the monk and other characters who have some kind of slow fall ability that allows them to do that. That's no longer something special that they can do if you let everybody do it. And second of all, falling damage in D&D is already way too little. When you think about the fact that the maximum damage you could take from a fall at terminal velocity is 20d6, then that means that you know, a higher level character, even a mid-level character, could easily survive a fall like that, where in reality, a fall like that would most assuredly kill you. So in my book, the falling damage in D&D is already overly forgiving and, you know, to the point of not even seeming remotely realistic oftentimes. So you're really just shooting yourself in the foot if you're making it even easier by letting people reduce that damage, unless they have a specific ability that tells them they can do that. But that's just my opinion. All right, so falling damage is pretty cut and dry and you know, easy to figure out. But what we have here is, for instance, rate of falling. So the basic gist here is if you're falling from a really high height, that it may take you more than one round, more than 6 seconds to hit the bottom. So this is just a way to figure out how far you fall every round. And it's pretty cut and dry. When you fall from a great height, you instantly descend up to 500 feet. If you're still falling on your next turn, you descend up to 500 feet at the end of that turn. And this just continues until you hit something. Really easy. Then we have flying creatures and falling. This is a pretty corner case, but could become something that begins to apply more and more in your games, especially if you have someone playing a character race that can fly, like the Aarakocra, or you know, certain subclasses can get the ability of fly, or certain racial variants. Like I think there's a tiefling and maybe even a dragonborn variant where you can get a fly speed. My wind elves in Primordia have a fly speed. The new Averial, the winged elves released in Unearthed Arcana have a fly speed, although I'll say my wind elves are much better. Just putting that out there. And they're balanced. They're not unbalanced, I don't think, but they're better than what Wizards came up with, I think. But that's just me. I might be a little biased there. So yeah, or, using magic. As soon as you have third level spells, you have the possibility of someone using the fly spell. So, in the beginning of play at low level, kind of a corner case, but as you play more and more, may become more and more prevalent of, what if a flying creature is falling? Can they use like flapping their wings or whatever to slow that fall or something like that? And indeed they can. And we're given a easy little system to handle that. And I'll let you look that up because like I said, at least at tier 1 and even tier 2 play, it's not super common that most groups are going to be dealing with flying creatures. Unless you're dealing with it as a DM, dealing with a flying monster. Sleep. Now, this is some great stuff. These are some clarifications I really appreciated. These are some things we've actually wondered about together on the show way back, wondering about, what condition you have while you're asleep. Turns out it's unconscious. And, how that affects things like perception checks and stuff like that. So here we go. So while a creature sleeps, it is subjected to the unconscious condition, which makes sense, but it's nice to have that spelled out. And here are some additional rules to deal with people that are sleeping. So first of all, waking someone. This comes up all the time. This is really important. A creature that is naturally sleeping, as opposed to being in a magically or chemically induced sleep, wakes up if it takes any damage or if someone else uses an action to shake or slap the creature awake. And notice exceptions to this general rule are magically induced sleep and chemically induced sleep. So I'd say someone who's passed out drunk, that's a chemically induced sleep. So this general rule would not necessarily apply in that situation. A sudden loud noise, such as yelling, thunder, or a ringing bell, also awakens someone that is sleeping naturally. So someone who's just normally asleep, you can use an action to wake them up by shaking them or slapping them or something like that. And also a loud sound such as yelling, thunder, or ringing bell will wake them up as well. And that's automatically, no roll required. Whispers, on the other hand, don't disturb sleep unless a sleeper's passive wisdom perception score is 20 or higher and the whispers are within 10 feet of the sleeper. Speech at a normal volume awakens a sleeper if the environment is otherwise silent, no wind, birdsong, crickets, street sounds, or the like, and the sleeper has a passive wisdom perception score of 15 or higher. So if your character's passive wisdom perception is lower than 15, even on a quiet night, people talking around you is not going to wake you up. However, someone shouting will, again, automatically wake you up. Sleeping in armor. This is another thing that comes up all the time. And it's funny, I house ruled this and I house ruled it exactly the way the rule is, which makes me wonder if maybe this was in the DMG somewhere and they're just reprinting it in the hopes that people will see it this time. Or I'm just good at guessing rules, maybe. I don't know. Or it's just very similar to how it's worked in previous editions. Or all the above. Sleeping in light armor has no adverse effect on the wearer, but sleeping in medium or heavy armor makes it difficult to recover fully during a long rest. When you finish a long rest during which you slept in medium or heavy armor, you regain only 1/4 of your spent hit dice, minimum of 1 die. So the general rule is when you take a long rest, you recover half your level in hit dice, minimum of 1 die. And so this specific rule, if you're wearing medium or heavy armor, you recover only 1/4 of your maximum hit dice, minimum of 1 die. If you have any levels of exhaustion, the rest doesn't reduce your exhaustion level. So if you've got exhaustion and you're sleeping in anything heavier than light armor, your exhaustion doesn't go away. So right there, I think those are two good penalties for sleeping in medium or heavy armor. They're not going to kill you. They're not going to foil the group completely. But they are drawbacks that a player is going to have to weigh. Is it worth the drawbacks to have my armor on if something happens during the night? And it may not be. Probably will depend on the situation. Going without a long rest. This is another thing that comes up all the time. A long rest is never mandatory, but going without sleep does have its consequences. If you want to account for the effects of sleep deprivation on characters and creatures, use these rules. Whenever you end a 24-hour period without finishing a long rest, you must succeed on a DC 10 Constitution saving throw or suffer 1 level of exhaustion. Love it. Short, sweet, to the point. It becomes harder to fight off exhaustion if you stay awake for multiple days. After the first 24 hours, the DC increases by 5 for each consecutive 24-hour period without a long rest. The DC resets to 10 when you finish a long rest. So you go 24 hours without sleeping, DC 10 con save. If you fail, you gain a level of exhaustion. Each additional day you go without sleeping, that DC increases by 5. So the second day without sleep is going to be DC 15 and so on. And remember, exhaustion is pretty serious. And once you have exhaustion, you're getting disability. You're getting disadvantage on a lot of rolls, including eventually these saving throws that you're making. So it's kind of a downward spiral. So you want to be careful with that. All right, next we have a little section on adamantine weapons. So in a Dungeon Master's Guide, we have rules for what does it mean when armor is made of adamantine. And in case you're wondering, it means that a critical hit against you is instead a normal hit. So what happens if my weapon is made of adamantine? So melee weapons and ammunition made of or coated with adamantine are unusually effective when used to break objects. Whenever an adamantine weapon or piece of ammunition hits an object, the hit is a critical hit. So that's, again, short, sweet, and I think awesome. It's again kind of a corner thing. In most combats, the fact that your sword or your hammer or whatever is adamantine isn't going to matter. But if you're trying to break someone's weapon or you're trying to bash through a wall or something like that, then it is going to matter because you're going to be doing double damage against objects, which is pretty awesome. The adamantine version of a melee weapon or of 10 pieces of ammunition costs 500 gold pieces more than the normal version, whether the weapon or ammunition is made of the metal or coated with it. So there you go. Now you even know what to charge for that good stuff. That makes sense because adamantine's pretty rare. Tying knots. Thank you, wizards. This is just for all us old schoolers out there. How could we have a DMG in a player's handbook without any information on how to resolve tying knots? And if I tie someone up, how good is that knot and how hard is it for them to get out? We used to have a proficiency back in second edition. Was it rope use? Or I think it was called rope use. But we used to have a proficiency that dealt with this. And we no longer have rope use as a skill. So I'm glad that they finally got around to telling us how to resolve this fairly. The rules are purposely open-ended concerning mundane tasks like tying knots, but sometimes knowing how well a knot was fashioned is important in a dramatic scene when someone is trying to untie a knot or slip out of one. I would say more than sometimes. I would say pretty much it's going to come up at least once in any campaign you run. If most likely it will come up numerous times because player characters are always taking prisoners to ask questions. They're always confining these people, tying them up. And, the prisoner that they take may not just, gamely sit there and be tied up. They might try to escape. And so these rules will come in useful. Or on the other hand, the players might get captured or tied up or something like that, and they need to escape. So this is really relevant stuff. Comes up all the time. The creature who ties the knot makes an intelligence sleight of hand check to do so. Notice we're saying intelligence sleight of hand here. The total of the check becomes the DC for an attempt to untie the knot with an intelligence sleight of hand check, or to slip out of it with a dexterity acrobatics check. And I love this too. There's two ways to foil a knot, right? You can untie it, or you can just slip out of it. And they give you different rolls for each. So if your character's really smart, you've got a better chance probably of untying the knot. But if your character is really dexterous, you probably have a better chance of slipping out of it. Or if your character is an acrobat, right? It's awesome. And they just mentioned here, this rule intentionally links sleight of hand with intelligence rather than dexterity. This is an example of how to apply the rule in the variant skills with different abilities section in chapter 7 of the Player's Handbook. And yeah, we talked about that way back in the Player's Handbook days when we talked about the Player's Handbook. But that is a rule I really highly recommend you use as much as you possibly can. It really adds a lot of robustness to this system and allows you to come up with ways to handle all kinds of things above and beyond what the designers of the game ever thought of. All right, so next is our tool proficiencies chapter or section, which we discussed in great detail in a previous episode. So we'll skip right past that. All right, next, after that, we have a section on spell casting. First off, we've got perceiving a caster at work. Many spells create obvious effects, explosions of fire, walls of ice, teleportation, and the like. Other spells, such as Charm Person, display no visible, audible, or otherwise perceptible sign of their effects, and could easily go unnoticed by someone unaffected by them. As noted in the Player's Handbook, you normally don't know that a spell has been cast unless the spell produces a noticeable effect. This is another thing that comes up all the time in games. Can I cast a spell without someone noticing, right? So this gives us an answer to that and tells us that, unless the spell specifies that it has a noticeable effect or obviously has verbal components you might hear or somatic components you might see or material components you might see someone manipulate, unless something like that is in place, you don't inherently know that magic is happening unless there's something obvious that you can perceive. Again, really, makes sense, really straightforward, but it's good to spell things like this out because people will make a lot of assumptions and start, well, what if this and what if that and what if that? And so it's easy to get really confused and turned around. So it is nice to spell these things out even when they seem really obvious. But what about the act of casting a spell? Is it possible to someone to perceive that a spell is being cast in their presence? And yeah, I already kind of hit this, but to be perceptible, the casting of a spell must involve a verbal, somatic, or material component. The form of a material component doesn't matter for the purposes of perception, whether it's an object specified in the spell's description, a component pouch, or a spell casting focus. The point is you can see them manipulating the whatever it is. It doesn't matter what it is. If the need for a spell's components has been removed by a special ability, such as the sorcerer's subtle spell feature or the innate spellcasting trait possessed by many creatures, the casting of the spell is imperceptible. If an imperceptible casting produces a perceptible effect, it's normally impossible to determine who casts the spell in the absence of other evidence. And that's a really, really important point. Okay, so if you've got someone casting a spell that the casting of it is imperceptible because maybe, they've got these feats or these abilities that make it so that there isn't a verbal or somatic component or whatever. So you can't perceive that they're casting a spell, or they're using psionics, which there's no way to perceive that someone's using psionics. But then the spell itself has a perceivable effect, then more often than not, you're not going to know who casts that spell. Now, sometimes it's going to be obvious, right? And this will be obvious from the description of the spell. Like, for instance, magic missile, if you see the person who's casting it and you see the target, you're probably going to be able to figure out who cast magic missile because, you see these missiles flying from one person to the other. But then there's other spells, like, for instance, say Charm Person, that there isn't a visible effect and you won't know who cast it. So this is another area where house ruling can have unintended consequences. And this is something you might not even think about at the time. But as GMs, one of our jobs often is to describe what's happening and to interpret die rolls in a descriptive way. And part of that is often describing spell effects, whether we're describing a spell that an NPC casts or even oftentimes a spell that a player character casts. You'll give a flavorful description of what that spell looks like, right? Now, my point here is you want to be careful when you're doing that. Make sure you know the spell and know whether that spell has visible effects or not. Because if you take a spell that does not have visible effects, like let's say Charm Person, I don't know if Charm Person has visible effects or not. And I don't have my player's handbook right here, so I can't look it up. But let's say it does not. If I describe Charm Person when people use it as, this glowing radiance, like going from the caster's hands around the target's person, now I'm giving that spell a visible effect. And now someone can know who cast that Charm Person when the spell is written in the book, they wouldn't be able to know. So I've actually house ruled that spell just with a description and added an element to that spell that didn't exist before, which is to say that you can't cast Charm Person on someone without people knowing who cast the Charm Person, without everybody nearby who can see it knowing. I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing. I'm not saying necessarily don't do it. But as in all things, when you're house ruling or interpreting rules, understand what you're doing and understand the consequences of what you're doing and understand how those consequences are going to affect specifically the player characters, but also the game overall. But it's really important how it affects the player characters, because maybe you have a player character that loves using Charm Person and doesn't want Charm Person to suddenly be, every time I cast Charm Person, everybody around knows that I did it and who I did it to, right? And who did it to them, right? Because as written, the spell isn't like that. But I, not even thinking of it as a house rule, but as a GM, as I'm describing Charm Person, I describe it in such a way that it would be very obvious to everyone in the room who cast Charm Person and who they cast it on. And I've effectively just nerfed Charm Person for that player and short-circuited how they want to use the spell. And I think the player would be reasonably irritated by that, especially if I just did it on the fly and they didn't realize when they made this character that I'm doing Charm Person very differently than the way it is in the book. And just to be complete, I did just go grab my player's handbook and checked. And indeed, there is nothing in the description of Charm Person that gives any indication that there is any discernible effect that an outsider observer could see. So if you are storytelling the Charm Person spell in such a way that it's obvious to people who aren't casting the spell and aren't having the spell cast on them what's going on, then you're changing the way Charm Person works, and you might be screwing over a player character in the process. Or you may not be, it may not matter. Or you may ultimately be screwing over one of your NPC spellcasters that you later want to use and want them to be sneaky with Charm Person. So again, I'm not saying don't house rule. I'm not saying don't take liberties in how you describe things, even if it changes the way the game works. I'm just saying understand what you're doing. Because otherwise you're going to create all kinds of messes and headaches for yourself that you're going to have to deal with later. And future you won't be thanking past you and will be wishing that past you had paid a little bit more attention to what the spell actually does. All right. So all of this discussion of perceiving spellcasting and what you can and can't perceive is directly relevant to our next topic, which is identifying a spell. We were talking about counterspell earlier. This becomes really important if you got counterspell. Can you identify a spell while it's being cast? Because that's a big deal, right? If I'm going to burn a spell slot and use counterspell to counter an NPC spell, it'd be nice to know what spell that is. First of all, to know if it's worth countering. Second of all, to know what level that spell is. So I know, am I okay using my 3rd level spell slot to counterspell, or should I use a higher spell slot? And am I, as the GM in that situation, am I giving too much information away if I just give that information to the players? Well, let's see what this says. Sometimes a character wants to identify a spell that someone else is casting or that was already cast. To do so, a character can use their reaction to identify a spell as it's being cast, or they can use an action on their turn to identify a spell by its effect after it is cast. So if you're trying to identify a spell that someone is actively casting right now, it's a reaction to do that. If you're trying to identify a spell that's already been cast but is ongoing, then it's an action to identify that. And that makes sense. It makes sense that it's a little more involved to identify a spell just from an ongoing effect than when you can actually see the person casting the spell. That makes perfect sense to me. If the character perceived the casting, so first of all, you have to be able to perceive it. So for instance, if it's a psionic ability or some spell that doesn't have verbal, somatic, or material components, then you can't perceive it being cast. But if you can perceive it being cast, or you can perceive the spell's effect, or you can perceive both of these things, then you can make an intelligence arcana check with your reaction or action. And again, it's a reaction if you're identifying a spell as it's being cast, and it's an action if you're identifying a spell that's ongoing and has already been cast. The DC equals 15 plus the spell's level. Easy peasy. If the spell is cast as a class spell and the character is a member of that class, the check is made with advantage. So if you're a wizard and you're trying to identify a spell that another wizard is casting, then you get advantage, assuming it's a wizard spell, of course, because it's a spell that's on your class's spell table. So you'd get advantage on that roll. And again, the DC is 15 plus the level of the spell. Easy peasy. For example, if the spellcaster casts a spell as a cleric, another cleric has advantage on the check to identify the spell. Some spells aren't associated with any class when they're cast, such as when a monster uses its innate spellcasting trait. And this is an important point. Unlike in some previous editions of the game, spells are not inherently tied to one class or another. So, the fireball spell isn't inherently a wizard spell or a sorcerer spell or whatever, just like flame strike isn't inherently a cleric spell. What matters is how a particular character is casting the spell. So for instance, a cleric could cast fireball as a cleric spell if they have fireball as a domain spell, for instance. So in that case, it doesn't matter if the person trying to identify the spell has fireball on their spell list. Like, let's say they're a wizard who has fireball on their spell list, because wizards do have fireball on their spell list. It doesn't matter that the cleric is casting fireball. They wouldn't get advantage because the cleric is casting that spell as a cleric. So the easy way to figure this out is, where is the spell coming from, right? Because a lot of times player characters will have spells from numerous sources. For instance, you might have a character who, for instance, is a fire genasi wizard. So this character can cast Burning Hands using their fire genasi racial trait, and they can also cast Burning Hands as a wizard. So it would depend. How are you casting this Burning Hands? Are you using a spell slot and casting it as a wizard? Then another wizard trying to identify that would get advantage. If, however, you're using your innate ability as a fire genasi to cast Burning Hands, then that wizard would not get advantage because you're not casting it as a wizard, you're casting it as a fire genasi. And this is even made more obvious by the fact that those two versions of Burning Hands, or whatever spell you're talking about, are going to use different spell casting stats a lot of times. For instance, wizard uses intelligence, but I think if I remember right, a fire genasi's racial spells use constitution. So their save DCs are going to be different. Everything's different because they're casting the spell differently. It's a different spell, really. All right. This intelligence arcana check represents the fact that identifying a spell requires a quick mind and familiarity with the theory and practice of casting. This is true even for a character whose spellcasting ability is wisdom or charisma. So even if you're using wisdom or charisma for your spellcasting, it's still an intelligence arcana check to identify another spell, even if the caster of that spell isn't using intelligence. It doesn't matter. It's always intelligence arcana. Being able to cast spells doesn't by itself make you adept at deducing exactly what others are doing when they cast their spells. And there was some discussion with Jeremy Crawford, the rules lead, on Twitter about this, some clarification. And, just want to make the point here that identifying a spell while it's being cast takes your reaction. Casting counterspell takes a reaction. You only get one reaction per round. So kind of by definition, you can't, in a round of combat, identify a spell that's being cast and counter it, because that would take 2 reactions to do, and you only have one. Now, you could maybe, this is in the realm of DM fiat and approval, your DM might let you say one character uses their reaction to identify the spell, and then another character uses their reaction to counter the spell. So you might allow that as a DM, but consider a couple things. First of all, they have to be able to communicate that information, right? So the character using their reaction to identify the spell has to be able to communicate what that spell is to the character that's then going to counter it. This happening during combat seems problematic, to say the least. And, technically by the rules, you are allowed to speak as part of your turn. And that's one of your kind of free interactions that you can do that don't take an action or a bonus action or anything like that. But technically that happens on your turn, not at any point in the round. And most times when you're taking a reaction, it's not on your turn. And indeed, if you're using your reaction to identify a spell someone else is casting, that's not your turn. So technically you can't talk at that point. So, part of it comes down to how you kind of view the rules and spell casting and all that. And also, how difficult or easy do you want this to be? And personally, I'm content to run the game as written. I think the limitations make a lot of sense. And I think in most situations, it's not going to be possible in a combat for one person to use a reaction to identify a spell that's being cast in the moment and then be able to communicate that information to another character who's now going to use their reaction to counter it. Because very simply, because, you can only talk on your turn, and it's not that character's turn. It's the character casting the spell's turn. So I wouldn't let that fly. And counter spell is already arguably one of the most powerful spells in the game, whether in the hands of a player character or in the hands of the GM. It's a very powerful spell. You can shut down a caster with it. I don't think it needs any help to be more powerful. And I think the fact that 99 times out of 100 times when you use counterspell, you're not going to know what spell is being cast, I think is part of the spell. And I think that's by design. And I think that's good design. It's a trade-off, right? It's a gamble. It's like, yeah, I've got this high card I can play that could theoretically negate the spell, but I don't know what the spell is. I don't know, is this a spell worth countering? It's a gamble. It's a tactical decision I have to make. Also notice it doesn't say anything here about knowing what level the spell is cast at. And I don't think that's something, just the way I conceptualize magic, I don't see that being something that you could figure out. Yes, maybe you can figure out that the wizard's casting fireball, but there's not going to be any way to tell if they're casting it at 3rd level or 6th level or whatever. So even if you somehow figure out what they're casting and you somehow communicate that to the person with counterspell, they still are going to have to gamble when it comes to what level am I going to cast that at, because I don't know what level they're casting their spell at, even if I know what the spell is. And all of this, I really feel like is, if you don't use these rules as they're written, I really think that you're giving counterspell more power and utility than it was designed to have. And it already has plenty of power and utility. It doesn't need any help. There might be some other spells in the game that need help, but counterspell is not one of them. All right, next we have invalid spell targets. A spell specifies what a caster can target with it. Any type of creature, a creature of a certain type, humanoid or beast, for instance, an object, an area, the caster, or something else. But what happens if a spell targets something that isn't a valid target? For example, someone might cast Charm Person on a creature believed to be a humanoid, not knowing that the target is in fact a vampire. If this issue comes up, handle it using the following rule. An even more common example, I think, is people using hold person on things that aren't people that aren't humanoids, right? I think hold person specifies humanoid. I think it's a specification, but hold person does not work on undead, does not work on giants, does not work on a lot of things. That's what hold monster is for. So what happens if you try to target someone with a spell that's an invalid target? If you cast a spell on someone or something that can't be affected by the spell, nothing happens to that target. But if you use the spell slot to cast the spell, the slot is still expended. If the spell normally has no effect on a target that succeeds on a saving throw, the invalid target appears to have succeeded on its saving throw, even though it didn't attempt one, giving no hint that the creature is in fact an invalid target. Otherwise, you perceive that the spell did nothing to the target. So this is really cool. The control of information in a D&D game is really, really important for a lot of things, for tone, for suspense, for just being able to have a mystery and being able to have a fascinating story with things to discover. So control of information is a very important job that we have as GMs. So you always want to be careful not to give away too much information that isn't earned. So that's really what this is dealing with here is, because think about it, if it wasn't this way, like let's say hold person, I think is a perfect example. Let's say the rule wasn't like this. And let's say if I try to cast hold person on someone who isn't a humanoid, like a vampire, and the spell doesn't work, I don't lose a spell slot and I know the spell didn't work, right? That's not the way this works. But let's say it did work that way. Well, that means I just figured out a really easy way to figure out if someone's a vampire or a werewolf or any kind of being that might be other than a humanoid disguised as a humanoid. All I got to do is cast hold person on them. And if it doesn't work, I know that they're not a humanoid and I didn't even lose a spell slot. It didn't cost me anything except the action to cast a spell to do that. So if that seems like cheating to you, it's because it is. That's not the way it's supposed to work, right? So that would be a huge loophole that players could and would take advantage of once they figured that out. So instead we say, no, if you cast hold person on the vampire, it's not going to work and you lose your spell slot. And second of off, you don't know why it didn't work. For all you know, they are a valid target and they just succeeded at their wisdom saving throw. You don't know. So just casting hold person on someone isn't going to give you information for free that you shouldn't have. For instance, this person's really a vampire, which is, I think, as it should be. Make your players work for that information. That's the game, part of the game. All right. So next we have a section on areas effect on the grid. And this is really, in a lot of ways, reiterating information that's already in the Dungeon Master's Guide. There are already diagrams in the Dungeon Master's Guide explaining all this. Or it might be the Player's Handbook. I think it's a Dungeon Master's Guide. But anyway, here it is again in a slightly different way. For those of you that use a grid, we'll skip that. Next, we have encounter building. This is pretty much word for word, as far as I can tell, exactly the same as what was in the Unearthed Arcana, which disappoints me because there are some inherent problems with this. And I'm really dismayed that Wizards either didn't realize there's problems with this or didn't care to fix it. And the biggest problem with it is that your multiple monster tables are not using the multiplier for having more than one monster. So these are not counting an action economy, which means if you just use this method and nothing else, and you're making encounters with as many monsters as you can, and you're using a lot of different monsters or a lot of one type of monster, chances are really good you're going to be creating what in the Dungeon Master's Guide would be called a deadly encounter, which if that's what you want to do, awesome. But there's nothing in here that tells you that you're making deadly encounters. So you got to be careful. But really the only thing I see in here that's additional or new compared with what's in the Unearthed Arcana is the quick matchups table. Next we have random encounters, a world of possibilities. This is fantastic. These are pages well spent. I already mentioned them in the overview, but we have encounter tables for all different types of terrains. And we have multiple tables for each tier of play for each terrain. Some reviews I've read seem to think that there's only one table for each terrain. It's not true. If you look closely, there's actually four, one for each of the four tiers of play. So for instance, coastal encounters, we've got a table for levels 1 to 4. We've got a table for levels 5 to 10, one for levels 11, 16, and one for levels 17 to 20. So we've got 4 tables of coastal encounters. These are awesome. I really wish we would have had these before I made my Misty Wood encounter table. It would have saved me a lot of time, because the first steps of my creating that table was basically creating all these tables that Wizards just gave us. I made all these tables. Now, I didn't break mine down by tier. I just made one huge table for each terrain and ordered them by CR, but it's all in one table. So yeah, I could have saved hours and hours if I would have had this instead. But this does not include anything from Volo's Guide, and does not include anything from any of the adventures or any other D&D products that have monsters in them. It's only stuff from the Monster Manual, which is unfortunate. This is a byproduct of the Adventurers League, which I'm going to bite my tongue not to say anything else about the Adventurers League, except to say that it's unfortunate that this organized play that a fraction of us participate in is dictating what's found in our books. Because of that, we have reprinted things in this book from Sword Course Adventurer's Guide, reprinted subclasses, for instance, because of the stupid +1 rule. I said I wasn't going to say anything about Adventurers League. Oh, well. I think the +1 rule is fine for Adventurers League. I think it's stupid that it has anything to do with the rest of us and what we do and don't get in the books that we buy. And it's probably a big part of why, this table doesn't have every monster in every official product on it, which is what it should have, right? With little notations that tell you what book that monster comes from. These tables are out of the book or out of the box, far less useful than they should be or could be, because they only include monsters from the Monster Manual, not from Volo's Guide, not from all the various adventures that have new monsters in them. It's like, WTF, Wizards. Come on, we don't all play Adventurers League. In fact, most of us probably don't play Adventurers League. Of course, it also lets them reprint stuff, which is less development time. Lets them not have to spend the time to figure out where all the monsters are and put them all on the table. So it saves them a bunch of work too. I'm sure that has something to do with it. All right. Anyway, enough bitterness about that. So yeah, these are nice tables. And another thing I like about them is they all have at least one or two things on them that are not just monster encounters, to again remind you that you can put anything you want on your encounter table, not just monsters. And you can put any kind of encounters on your table, not just combat encounters. And they also remind you in here that even a monster on a table, like an invisible stalker, just because it's a monster on your table doesn't mean it has to be a combat encounter. You can come up with a non-combat encounter using an invisible stalker. Your imagination as a GM is the only limit here. This table is not a limit. You are, my friend. All right, next we have Traps Revisited. Again, from what I can tell, exactly word for word copy pasted from Unearthed Arcana. Don't see any changes here. So we can skip that. Any of this stuff I'm skipping, if you want to hear more about it, let me know. GameMastersJourney@gmail.com. I'll be happy to talk about it. But I feel like this stuff is old news because this was in Unearthed Arcana ages ago, and I don't see anything different. And next we have our expanded downtime rules, or revisited downtime rules. And again, this is straight from an Unearthed Arcana. Don't really see anything different. So I'm not going to go super deep into this. But we do have some additional downtime activities compared with what we're given in the Player's Handbook and the Dungeon Master's Guide, as well as alternative ways to handle some of those activities that we've already been given. So we've got buying a magic item, carousing, crafting an item, and this is mainly mundane items. Then we have crime. Oh, wait, hang on. Before we get to crime, under crafting an item, we also have crafting magic items and brewing potions of healing, things like that. Then we have crime. We've got gambling, pit fighting, relaxation, religious service, research, scribing a spell scroll, selling a magic item, training, work. Yeah. And so those are some downtime activities. And this may be something I return to. We're getting pretty long today, so I'm going to wrap this up. But this might be something I return to in a later episode. If you'd like to hear more about this downtime activities revisited section, let me know. GameMastersJourney@gmail.com. And finally, we have a slightly different system for awarding magic items. So it talks about if you use the tables in the DMG, that you're on average going to end up with, about the right number and power level of magic items for your player characters, that at least the folks at Wizards feel like you should have. Also, again, makes the point that magic items are optional. The game is balanced around player characters not having any magic items. And so you can run an entire campaign all the way to 20th level and never hand out a single magic item if you want to. I wouldn't recommend it. A lot of the fun of the game is magic items, but you don't have to hand them out. It's not like 3rd edition or 4th edition where you have to hand out magic items like candy just so that the player characters can compete with what they're going up against. The game is designed so that magic items aren't required, and people will wonder, well, what about, monsters that require magic items to get through damage resistance or even damage invulnerability? And Wizards' answer to that are things like the magic weapon spell, shillelagh, things like that. So there are ways that spellcasters can provide the party with some magic weapons. And they talk about, if you don't have anyone in the party that has access to that kind of magic, then, them not having magic items might be a bit more of a problem that you want to address. So this different method of handing out magic items is kind of, the one in the DMG is really great for just doing it randomly. If you just want to make some rolls and generate random treasure, and who knows what the player characters get, even the GM is surprised, then that's a great system to use. This is more for the GM that's going to hand select items instead of rolling for them randomly, and basically gives you a table that tells you how many different types of items the player should have as a party, as a group at any given level, and how many they should get during their entire career. So this is really straightforward. Now, one thing that they add here that's really interesting is the concept of minor versus major magic items. So we already have magic items defined by rarity, going from common to uncommon to rare, very rare, and then legendary, which, is their power level roughly. But we also have this distinction of minor versus major items. So minor magic items can be common, uncommon, rare, very rare, or even legendary. And the idea is that you'll get more minor items throughout the career of your character. You'll get more of those. On the other hand, major items can only be uncommon, rare, very rare, or legendary. So there are no common major items, and major items are meant to be handed out more sparingly and less often. So just to give you an idea here from the table, for levels 1 to 4, this table recommends, and this is for the entire party. This isn't for one character. This is for the entire party together. For levels 1 to 4, you would, as far as minor magic items, you'd hand out 6 common, 2 uncommon, and 1 rare. As far as major items, 2 uncommon, and that's it. So you see a huge difference there, right? The minor items, we're getting 2 uncommon and a rare and 6 common, where the major items we're getting only 2 uncommon. All right. So for levels 1 to 4, that's a total of 4 uncommon items, 2 of them minor, 2 of them major. Now, it turns out that this distinction of minor and major magic items is a distinction that existed in the DMG. It just wasn't pointed out. And so how this works is, let me find it here where they tell you. Minor and major items. Here we go. So if you look at the magic item tables in the Dungeon Master's Guide, the minor items are the items listed on magic item tables A through E as an elephant. And the major items are on magic item tables F through I. So there you go. So this is really cool and a different way to approach, kind of figuring out how many magic items you want to hand out. And, me personally, I do what I do. I'm a very creative GM. So I will sometimes roll on magic item tables, or I'll sometimes pick items from it, or I'll sometimes keep rolling until I roll something I like. This just gives me another tool for my toolbox and another way to really quickly see, am I handing out a lot more items than would be average or less, or what? Kind of where am I at? So this is a really useful tool, I think, even if you don't use this to decide what to give out, to just use it as a measuring stick to kind of see, how am I doing as far as treasure I've handed out, as far as magic items? Have I handed out a lot compared to your average campaign, or about average, or not very much? And, you may do something with that information. You may not. You may be like, oh, I haven't handed out very many items compared to what this says, but I don't care. It's all good. I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing. Or you might look and say, oh, I haven't handed out as many items as this says I could have or should have. Maybe I'll hand out a few more because, I've been wanting to hand out items, but maybe I've been holding myself back because I didn't want to overdo it. And now I look at this table and I see, oh, I could hand out a few more items and I'd be right in line with what they're recommending. So I think you can use it as that kind of a guide. It doesn't have to be a straitjacket that you feel bound to. All right, here is a little box here. I already talked about this, but I want to read you their words. Are magic items necessary in a campaign? The D&D game is built on the assumption that magic items appear sporadically and that they are always a boon, unless an item bears a curse. Characters and monsters are built to face each other without the help of magic items, which means that having a magic item always makes a character more powerful or versatile than a generic character of the same level. And that's a really important thing to keep in mind. As soon as you hand out magic items, even minor magic items, you're making your characters more powerful than what the game is assuming, which is going to affect like your encounter building, right? So if you're using encounter building guidelines, either from the DMG or from this book, and you've handed out magic items, then you got to remember, okay, my characters are a little bit more powerful, or maybe a lot more powerful than what this system I'm using is assuming. And keep that in mind and adjust for that. As a DM, you never have to worry about awarding magic items just so the characters can keep up with the campaign's threats. Magic items are truly prizes. Are they useful? Absolutely. Are they necessary? No. Magic items can go from nice to necessary in the rare group that has no spellcasters, no monk, and no NPCs capable of casting magic weapon. Having no magic makes it extremely difficult for a party to overcome monsters that have resistances or immunity to non-magical damage. In such a game, you'll want to be generous with magic weapons or else avoid using such monsters. So I love that there's two solutions to this, right? So, some GMs like to run like a really gritty, realistic campaign, which I often wonder why you're trying to do that with D&D, but that's another topic. Want to run a gritty, realistic, grimdark D&D campaign, and so they don't want to hand out any magic items. I've even seen DMs like remove all the subclasses that give you spellcasting ability because they don't want any magic. Well, just keep in mind this impact, and you're going to want to really think hard about using monsters that have immunity or resistance to non-magical damage if you're not going to hand out any magic items. And like they said, if you don't have spellcasters or monks or druids or other people that can have magical attacks as part of their class abilities in the party. So I love that they give you two solutions to that. You can either hand out some magic items, or you can just not use those creatures that have those resistances and immunities. Or a third option, if this is a campaign choice, if you're running like a grimdark campaign with very little or no magic, which again, why are you using D&D? But anyway, if you're trying to do that, well, first of all, you're probably not going to be using a lot of those monsters anyway, because they don't fit in that kind of campaign. But if you do want to use one of those monsters, you could just get rid of those abilities, get rid of their resistance or immunity to non-magical damage. Just remove that ability. Now, keep in mind, that's going to impact their CR. So you're going to want to figure out what that does to their CR and see, how you sit with that. It might be okay, or you might want to give them some other ability or something to kind of buff them back up again. That's up to you, and you'll have to figure that out based on what kind of encounter you're trying to build. But that's another way you could approach it. Now, another thing they have here is overstocking an adventure. Now, this is really interesting. I've never seen this concept before. So this is useful if you're designing your own adventures, and especially if you're designing adventures that you intend people other than yourself to run. They talk about the magic item tables in this section are based on the number of items the characters are expected to receive, not the number of items that are available in an adventure. When creating or modifying an adventure, assume that the characters won't find all the items you place in it unless most of the loot is in easy to find locations. Here's a good rule of thumb. An adventure can include a number of items that's 25% higher than the numbers in the tables round up. For example, an adventure designed to take characters from 1st to 4th level might include 14 items rather than 11, in the expectation that 3 of those items won't be found. So that's a really interesting concept there, that you would actually design your adventure with extra treasure in it, assuming that a quarter of the treasures the player characters aren't going to find. And that can really be useful depending on what kind of adventure you're running. And, like they said, just think about, if you have hidden treasure rooms, or, you think it likely that they're not going to find anything or everything, then that makes sense. But if it's a really straightforward kind of thing where nothing's really hidden and they're going to find all the treasure, then you probably don't need to add another extra 25%. So, you just got to use your best judgment. But I love that they give us this concept here. Next, we have common magic items. And this is something I'd love to talk about if we weren't going so long. So this is something I may return to. If you'd like me to, let me know, gamemastersjourney@gmail.com. But these are just additional common magic items. What we're given in the PHB and the DMG as far as common items are potions of healing, spell scrolls for cantrips and 1st level spells, and potions of climbing. And I think that's it. So we're given a lot more common items here, and just really flavorful stuff. Most of these aren't going to be at all useful in combat or anything like that. They're just really cool, flavorful things, and I really love them. And not only are these great items that you can sprinkle into treasures and give as rewards that aren't going to have as much of an impact on the power curve of your game as other magic items that you might give out. But they're a way to show the presence of magic in your world without things getting crazy Monty Hall. And they can also be inspirations. You can use these ideas and come up with many more common items very, very easily. So next we have new magic item tables using this new method, which divides items up into minor and major by the different rarities. Very useful stuff. Another thing I like about these tables is they tell you what type of item it is. Like, is it a wondrous item? Is it a wand? Is it a staff? Is it a weapon? And they tell you whether or not it requires attunement right on the table, which is really handy. And if it requires attunement by a specific class or classes, it also tells you that, which is super cool. And that, my friends, is the end of chapter 2. Next up in the book is chapter 3, spells. And then we have let's see, Appendix A, shared campaigns, Appendix B, character names. And there we go. That's the extent of Xanathar's Guide to Everything. So at this point, I've given an overview of everything in the book, and we've gone into quite a bit of detail on the new trinkets, or not trinkets, on the new tool proficiencies expansion systems, and also now on a lot of the other stuff in Chapter 2, which is for GMs. But like I said, if there is anything that I skipped or I glossed over that you'd like to hear more about, I would be happy to talk about it. Just let me know. I just don't want to go into too much detail on stuff that people aren't interested in. And this is already my third episode on Xanathar's Guide. So everybody I've heard from is super excited about Xanathar's Guide and happy to hear about it. But, who knows about all those people I don't hear from. So I don't want to beat this horse more than people want me to. Wow, that metaphor turned dark. All right. So yeah, I love Xanathar's Guide. There's so much good stuff in here. And like I said, we breeze through the player side of it. So, if you play quite a bit, there's so many more options for your player characters, as well as lots of great ways to flesh out your character's background and flesh out your character from an RP perspective, based on your class and for all the classes, which is super cool. Really great stuff. So I can't recommend Xanathar's Guide enough. This and Volo's are definitely my favorite books for the game beyond the basic 3. And if you haven't gotten a chance to flip through a copy, I really highly recommend that you go to a bookstore and check one out and flip through it, or just take the plunge and buy one. I think you'll be pretty happy with it. If you do decide to buy a copy on Amazon, I would ask you to please visit the show notes for this episode at starwalkerstudios.com and click the Xanathar's Guide to Everything link in the show notes. And that will take you directly to Amazon and puts in my referral code so that you buying Xanathar's Guide or whatever else you buy on Amazon will help out myself and Star Walker Studios. And I greatly appreciate everyone who does that. Really, really helps out a lot. So let me know what you think of Xanathar's Guide to Everything, and let me know if there's anything else you'd like me to cover. Well, that's going to wrap it up for episode 192 of Game Master's Journey. If you'd like to get a hold of me, you can email me at gamemastersjourney@gmail.com. You can also follow me on Twitter at Lex Starwalker. You can call the Game Master's Journey voicemail number and leave me a message. If your question or feedback is entertaining or enlightening, or both, you might even hear your message on the show. That number is 951-GMJ-LEX1. That's 951-465-5391. If you have any questions, feedback, or suggestions for future topics, I would love to hear from you. You can find the show notes for this episode at starwalkerstudios.com/GameMastersJourney, as well as links to connect with the Game Masters Journey community on Google Plus and Discord, where you can share ideas, questions, and stories with other listener GMs. If you'd like to support the show, the best way you can help us out is by becoming a patron. You can find out all about becoming a patron at patreon.com/StarwalkerStudios. You can also check the bottom of the show notes for all the other ways you can support the show, including purchasing a t-shirt or my D&D Adventure to the Trickster's Labyrinth at starwalkerstudios.com, or you can use my Amazon referral link when you shop on Amazon. You can find all these ways to support the show and more at starwalkerstudios.com/support. I hope that you have a chance to play your favorite RPG this week. I hope you have a chance to run your favorite RPG. I'll be back soon with another episode of Game Master's Journey. Until then, game on.
This has been a Star Walker Studios production, your source for quality gaming and hobby podcasts.
This episode's music, courtesy of Cloudwalker, Transboy, Renfield, Stanko, and Ish. See the show notes for more details at starwalkerstudios.com/GameMastersJourney.